Captain Dorian Vex stood at the helm of his starship, gazing out at the dark expanse of space ahead. The mission before him was delicate. An intergalactic summit with the Nyari Dominion, one of the most powerful alien empires in the galaxy. They were known for their vast fleets, advanced technology, and their strict, caste-based society. As a high-ranking officer in the Terran fleet, Dorian had dealt with negotiations before, but none like this. Humanity had always been seen as inferior to the Nyari, barbarians in their eyes. The stakes were high, and Dorian knew that failure could mean disaster for Earth and its colonies. The journey had taken him to the heart of the Nyari homeworld, a planet of gleaming crystal cities and towering spires. From the moment he set foot on the planet's surface, Dorian felt the weight of their gaze, the cold, calculating eyes of beings who considered themselves superior to all other life forms. He was an outsider here, a mere human, yet he had been chosen for this mission because of his diplomatic skills and reputation for never backing down. His commanding officer had warned him that this would be no easy task, but Dorian was no stranger to challenges. As he entered the Grand Hall for the first round of negotiations, the air felt thick with tension. The Nyari delegates, their regal bearing and otherworldly presence almost intimidating, sat in their seats, waiting for him to speak. But then his eyes locked onto her. Vilessa. She was unlike any Nyari Dorian had ever seen before. A noblewoman of great standing, she sat with a grace and poise that commanded attention. Her violet eyes, shimmering like twin stars, held a depth that seemed to see straight through him. While the others remained cold and distant, Vilessa's gaze softened when it met his. It was as if she was seeing something more than just a Terran officer, a curiosity that intrigued him. Dorian couldn't explain it. There was an aura around Vilessa that felt different. Where the other Nyari appeared detached and calculating, Vilessa seemed to carry a quiet intensity, as if she had secrets she was too careful to reveal. He tried to focus on the task at hand, the formalities of the summit, but every time his thoughts drifted away, he found himself drawn back to her presence. It was not just her beauty, though she was undoubtedly stunning. There was something in her demeanor, a subtle defiance in the way she held herself, that spoke of strength. The negotiations began, but Dorian's attention kept slipping toward Vilessa. She was more than just a bystander at this meeting. She was a voice of influence in her people's ruling class. Yet there was something unsettling in the way the other Nyari looked at her, like they were aware of something he wasn't. Dorian had to remind himself that, despite the connection he felt, he was there on a mission. It wasn't the time for distractions. But then, during a break in the talks, a quiet voice whispered in his ear. "You must understand, Captain Vex, not all of us believe the Nyari way is right." Dorian turned sharply. It was Vilessa. She stood close, but not so much that it would seem inappropriate. Her voice was low, almost secretive. You shouldn't be here," Dorian replied, his heart pounding a little faster than usual. His training told him to keep the conversation professional, but something about Vilessa's presence made it impossible to ignore. Vilessa's gaze softened again. She wasn't like the others. There was a warmth in her eyes, a flicker of something deeper. "You are human, yes, and you're here to speak for your people. But do you understand the way we live?" She paused, glancing around the room as if making sure no one else could hear. "The Nyari are bound by tradition, and I am bound by duty. But there is more to us, more than they let on, more than I can say here." Dorian stood frozen, captivated by her words. Was she warning him, or trying to tell him something more? It was clear she wasn't just another cold Nyari noblewoman, and that, above all, intrigued him. Before he could say anything, Vilessa stepped away, vanishing into the crowd of diplomats. But her words lingered, leaving a strange feeling in his chest. Something had shifted in him, something he wasn't prepared for. He would have to be careful. There was far more at play here than simple politics. And Vilessa, She was at the center of it all. Dorian Vex couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening beneath the surface, something he wasn't seeing clearly. After Vilesa's quiet warning, he spent the rest of the day on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering what she meant. Was she trying to warn him about the dangers lurking in the Nyari dominion? Or was it something else entirely? His mind raced, but he couldn't ask her directly. He had to maintain the delicate balance of diplomacy. After all, he was still a Terran officer, and his mission had to come first. Later that evening, Dorian found himself alone in his quarters, trying to prepare for the next round of negotiations. He had his work cut out for him, finding a way to ensure peace with the Nyari, all while preventing them from expanding further into human space. But even as he reviewed his notes, his thoughts kept drifting back to Vilesa. She had told him there was more to the Nyari than the cold, rigid empire they presented to outsiders, and he couldn't ignore her words. The next day, as the summit continued, Dorian saw Vilesa again, but this time, she didn't approach him directly. Instead, she stood in the back of the room, watching the proceedings with an intensity that was impossible to miss. Her eyes never left Dorian's as he spoke to the Nyari delegates, and for the briefest moment, he felt as though there was something unspoken between them. It was as if she was silently urging him to push harder, to ask the right questions, to challenge the way things were. After the session ended, Dorian took a step away from the crowd to collect his thoughts. He needed air, space to clear his head. That's when Vilesa appeared at his side, her footsteps quiet on the polished floors. She didn't say anything at first, but the intensity of her presence made Dorian's pulse quicken. "I thought you might need a break," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "The others have been watching you closely." Dorian turned to face her, trying to mask the surprise he felt at her sudden appearance. "I didn't expect you to be so interested in these negotiations," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Vilesa's gaze softened, but there was something dark behind her eyes. "I may not agree with everything that happens here, Captain Vex, but I have my place. We all have our roles to play, don't we?" Dorian studied her, trying to read between the lines. There was an air of quiet rebellion in her voice, one that didn't quite match her noble status. She wasn't like the other Nyari, where they were cold, rigid, and calculated. Vilesa seemed to have a fire within her, a desire for something more than what her people were offering. "You're different," he said, his voice almost a murmur. He couldn't help himself. He had to say it. Her lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. "I'm different because I see what others don't. I see the cracks in the Nyari system, the way it's suffocating us all. They don't want you to know that, Captain. They want you to believe we're perfect, that our way of life is flawless. But it isn't. And I can't pretend anymore." Dorian's heart beat faster as he listened to her words. What she was saying went against everything the Nyari had ever shown to the rest of the galaxy. The Empire was known for its unwavering strength and unity, but Vilesa was telling him there was more, a fracture within the very core of their society. Was this why she had been so distant during the summit? Was she trying to warn him of something far more dangerous than a simple political rivalry? "You're risking everything," Dorian said, his voice low, his eyes locked onto hers. "If they find out what you're doing, they'll destroy you." Vilesa met his gaze with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "Perhaps that's what it will take. But I can't live in a world that's built on lies and oppression. And I can't watch my people suffer any longer." There was a long pause as the weight of her words hung in the air between them. Dorian didn't know what to say. His mind was spinning, trying to process what he had just heard. Vilesa wasn't just a noblewoman. She was a rebel, a voice of dissent within a tyrannical system. She had chosen to speak to him, a human, because she trusted him enough to reveal the truth about her people's crumbling foundation. I don't know what to say," Dorian admitted. "I didn't come here to start a revolution." Vilesa smiled faintly again, but this time it was warmer, less guarded. "You didn't, Captain. But sometimes revolutions find us, whether we're ready or not. The days following the tense conversation with Valessa passed in a blur for Captain Dorian Vex. Every moment was filled with the pressure of negotiations, yet his thoughts never strayed far from her. The diplomatic talks between the Terrans and the Nyari were growing more heated by the hour, but Dorian couldn't help but wonder if there was something bigger at play, something that went far beyond simple politics. Valessa's words kept echoing in his mind, and the more he thought about them, the more certain he became that she wasn't just a noblewoman caught in the web of Nyari tradition. She was a woman on the edge of something far more dangerous. Then came the moment that changed everything. The council had gathered once again in the Grand Hall to discuss the future of the Terran-Nyari alliance. The stakes were higher than ever. War was on the horizon if no agreement could be reached. Dorian stood at the front, his hands clasped behind his back as he addressed the gathered Nyari leaders, trying his best to mask the growing tension he felt in his chest. But as he scanned the room, his eyes locked onto Valessa. She was standing at the far end, her gaze fixed on him. Though she made no move to engage, Dorian's heart skipped a beat. There was something different in her expression, something that spoke of urgency. Without thinking, Dorian excused himself from the table and made his way through the crowd toward Valessa. She didn't speak at first, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something, an unreadable emotion that seemed to shift like a shadow. "You need to leave," Valessa said, her voice low, barely audible amidst the noise of the hall. "Now." Dorian's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "The talks." "Forget the talks. They've already been decided," she interrupted, glancing around nervously, as if someone might be watching. "The Nyari are preparing to move against humanity. They plan to launch an attack on your colonies. This isn't about peace. This is about control." Dorian's stomach sank. He had suspected something wasn't right, but hearing it confirmed shook him to the core. The Nyari had always seemed so sure of themselves, so confident in their power. He never imagined they would resort to such an aggressive move. But Valessa's warning made it clear this was no ordinary political disagreement. This was the beginning of a war. "I can't just leave. My people need me here," Dorian said, his voice tight. Valessa took a step closer, her eyes burning with determination. "You have to. If you stay, they'll kill you, and they'll use you to justify the attack. You're a symbol, Captain, and right now your life is worth more to them dead than alive." Dorian's mind raced. He had come here to negotiate peace, to secure humanity's future. But now it seemed he was caught in the middle of a deadly game, with Valessa acting as the only ally he had. But how could he leave? How could he walk away from the very thing he had fought so hard for? "What do you suggest I do?" Dorian asked, his voice hoarse. Valessa hesitated for a moment, as though weighing the danger of her next words. "There's a way out, if you're willing to take it. The right of proving." Dorian frowned. "The right of proving. That's an old Nyari tradition, isn't it? A trial by combat. You can't be serious." "I am," Valessa said, her voice steady. "If you challenge one of their champions and win, they have no choice but to honor the outcome. It's an ancient law, one they still follow in times of great strife." Dorian couldn't believe what he was hearing. A trial by combat. The very idea seemed absurd, yet he knew Valessa wouldn't lie to him. She was offering him a chance, maybe the only chance, to escape the web of deceit the Nyari had spun around him. But who would he fight? The Nyari were physically superior to humans in almost every way. The thought of facing one of their champions in battle seemed like suicide. "You don't have to do this, Captain," Valessa said, sensing his hesitation. "But if you don't, there won't be anything left to save. The Nyari will crush your colonies, and it will be too late for peace." Dorian took a deep breath. Valessa's words rang true. He was trapped, and the only way out was to take a risk, a dangerous one. But he had never been one to back down from a challenge. If he could fight for peace, even in the most impossible way, he would. "I'll do it," Dorian said, his voice firm with resolve. "I'll challenge their champion, but I'll need your help." Vilessa nodded. "I'll be there. You won't face this alone." The weight of the decision settled on Dorian's shoulders, but in that moment, he knew what he had to do. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, but if he could somehow win this trial, everything could change. For humanity, for Vilessa, and for the future they could build together. Captain Dorian Vex stood in the quiet of his quarters, staring out at the stars beyond the ship's window. His mind was spinning. Vilessa's words had set a chain of events in motion, and now nothing felt certain. The Nyari were preparing for war, and the only way to stop it, to save humanity, was to fight in an ancient trial known as the Right of Proving. It was an offer that seemed insane. A combat trial against a champion of the Nyari, a race far stronger, faster, and more durable than humans. Yet there was no other choice. Vilessa had promised to help him, but Dorian had no illusions. He was about to face a battle that could very well end his life. Vilessa had explained the rules to him in detail. The Right of Proving was an ancient ritual used by the Nyari in moments of extreme political conflict. The challenge could be issued by anyone, and if accepted, the two fighters would face off in a public trial. It wasn't just about physical strength. Strategy, cunning, and resourcefulness often played as much of a role as raw power. But even so, Dorian couldn't shake the thought that no matter how clever he was still facing an enemy far more capable than he could ever be. The news of Dorian's challenge spread quickly throughout the Nyari court. It was a spectacle. An outsider, a human, daring to take on their strongest warrior. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was a sense of excitement too. To the Nyari, it was an ancient tradition, a way of proving worth. But to Dorian, it felt like a suicide mission. He hadn't been trained for this, hadn't prepared for a fight of this magnitude. His strength was nothing compared to theirs. He'd been trained in diplomacy and strategy, not combat. But Vilessa had been insistent. "You don't have to match their strength," she told him. "You only need to outsmart them." The Nyari respect strength, but they value wit above all else. You'll need to think on your feet, and in this arena, your mind is as important as your body. Her words gave him some comfort, but the weight of the challenge still pressed down on him. Dorian spent the next several hours in his quarters, preparing as best as he could. Vilessa had arranged for a quiet training session where she taught him about the Nyari way of combat, how to move, how to defend, how to strike. She wasn't the warrior he was about to face, but she was intelligent and quick, and her guidance helped him hone his reflexes, even if only a little. They practiced different scenarios, where she acted as the opponent, showing him how to dodge and counter. Each time she struck, he felt the raw power in her movements, even though she was holding back. He knew the opponent he would face in the trial would have no mercy. It made his stomach churn with dread. Still, Dorian couldn't afford to doubt himself. Vilessa's faith in him kept him going, but there was another reason he couldn't back down: humanity. If he didn't succeed in this trial, the Nyari would have a justification to destroy human colonies across the galaxy. Lives would be lost, his people, his friends, his family. This was bigger than his personal fear. It was bigger than anything he had ever faced before. The day of the trial arrived. The arena was massive, a colossal structure carved into the side of a mountain, filled with thousands of Nyari spectators. Dorian stood at the entrance, looking out at the sea of faces, his heart racing. The rules of the trial were simple. Only one could walk out alive. The arena itself was a maze of traps, obstacles, and open spaces designed to test both strength and intelligence. Dorian had no idea what to expect, but he knew one thing: he couldn't fight fair. He had to use everything he had. Vilessa stood nearby, watching from the sidelines, her eyes locked on him. She had arranged for him to have some minimal armor, nothing compared to what his opponent would wear, but enough to provide a little protection. She gave him a nod of encouragement, her expression unreadable. Dorian didn't know what her plan was, but he trusted her. And in that moment, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. As the battle horn sounded, signaling the start of the trial, Dorian's heart pounded in his chest. His opponent, Jaros, the Nhyari warlord, stepped into the arena, his massive form towering over Dorian. The crowd roared in excitement, but all Dorian could focus on was the challenge ahead. He wasn't going to let fear control him. He wasn't going to die today. Vilessa had risked everything to help him. Now it was time to prove that humanity's spirit could overcome even the most impossible odds. The air in the arena was thick with tension as the crowd's roar reverberated through the stands. Dorian Vex's heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief moment, everything around him felt like a blur. Across the arena stood Jaros, the towering Nhyari warlord, his dark eyes glowing with cold confidence. The warlord's armor gleamed under the harsh sunlight, a perfect contrast to the simple armor Dorian wore, which was little more than a protective vest and light padding. The battle horn sounded again, signaling the start of the rite of proving, and Dorian's mind immediately went into overdrive. Vilessa's words echoed in his ears. Outsmart him. Use the arena, not just your fists. Dorian knew that brute strength alone wouldn't help him survive this. Jaros was far stronger, faster, and more experienced. But he wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for humanity, for his people. If he didn't win, they would all be doomed. With the sound of the horn still ringing in his ears, Dorian took a deep breath and focused. He couldn't afford to waste time with hesitation. Jaros took a slow step toward him, and Dorian instinctively backed up, putting distance between them. The Nhyari warlord didn't rush in. He was confident, almost arrogantly so, taking his time as though he had all the patience in the world. He knew Dorian would tire, that the longer the fight lasted, the more the human would be at a disadvantage. But Dorian wasn't about to give Jaros that satisfaction. He needed to keep moving. He needed to make Jaros think, make him second-guess his every step. The Nhyari warlord's massive sword was already raised, ready to strike, but Dorian had a different plan. Without warning, he sprinted to the left, using the rocky terrain of the arena to his advantage. The ground was uneven, with large boulders scattered throughout. He darted behind one, watching as Jaros charged forward, his eyes narrowing in frustration. Dorian ducked behind the boulder just in time, barely avoiding the warlord's strike. The Nhyari's sword collided with the rock with a deafening crash, and the sheer force of the blow caused the ground to tremble. The crowd gasped in unison. Dorian's breath caught in his throat. He had come so close to being crushed, but the Nhyari's power was a reminder of how dangerous this trial truly was. He couldn't let himself get cornered again. For a moment, everything was quiet. Dorian stayed hidden behind the boulder, his pulse racing as he tried to think of his next move. He could hear Jaros grumbling, frustrated by the fact that Dorian had managed to evade him. The warlord circled the boulder, trying to find an opening. It was now or never. Dorian peeked out from behind the rock, his eyes scanning the battlefield. He had to be smart. He had to think like a strategist, not a fighter. As Jaros moved closer, Dorian saw his chance. The warlord was too focused on the boulder to notice the trap he was about to walk into. With a burst of speed, Dorian darted to the side, using the terrain to stay out of Jaros's line of sight. He ran for a cluster of rocks farther up the arena, knowing that it would force Jaros to follow him, and it would give Dorian the height advantage he desperately needed. But it was a risk. Dorian knew it. If he miscalculated, if Jaros caught up to him before he could reach the higher ground, it would be over. His mind raced, calculating the distance, timing the movements. Jaros was close now, just a few steps behind him. Dorian gritted his teeth and sprinted harder, the wind rushing in his ears. Just as he reached the rocks, he turned, quickly scaling one of them to get to a higher vantage point. He could see Jaros's eyes lock onto him, and the warlord let out a primal growl of rage. Dorian didn't hesitate. He grabbed a jagged rock from the ground, throwing it with all his strength toward Jaros's head. The rock hit its mark, causing Jaros to stagger backward in surprise. It wasn't enough to defeat him, but it gave Dorian the precious moment he needed to climb higher and reposition himself. From the top of the rock, Dorian could see the entire arena laid out before him. Every trap, every boulder, every possible escape route. He had the upper hand now, and he could feel the momentum shifting. But the fight was far from over. Jaros wasn't going to give up that easily. His pride would demand retribution, and Dorian knew that the next move would be critical. He wasn't out of danger yet. From his elevated position, Dorian waited for Jaros to make his next move. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for humanity's future. If he could win, he would prove that even against impossible odds, a single human could make a difference. Dorian Vex stood high on the rocky outcrop, his heart hammering in his chest as he watched Jaros recover from the rock Dorian had thrown. The Nyari warlord's eyes burned with fury, his pride bruised more than his body. Dorian knew that his opponent wouldn't take this lightly. The warlord's next move would be calculated, dangerous, and without mercy. Dorian gripped a jagged rock in his hand, ready to throw it again if necessary. But he knew that a direct attack would be suicide. He needed to outsmart Jaros, not overpower him. The warlord roared, a deep guttural sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Dorian's feet. Jaros wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. The crowd's loud cheers and jeers only intensified his rage. He looked up at Dorian, his gaze locking onto the human with a deadly focus. Jaros crouched, preparing himself for the next move, his muscles tensing like a spring ready to snap. Dorian's instincts screamed at him to move, to act fast, but he couldn't afford to be reckless. Every step, every choice could be his last. Dorian's mind raced. He could hear Vilesa's voice in his head again. Stay focused. Think, don't just react. The arena is your ally, not your enemy. It was easier said than done, but the advice stuck. The arena was full of obstacles, things he could use to his advantage. It wasn't just about brute strength. It was about using the environment, using his wits. Jaros might be stronger, but Dorian had something the warlord didn't: the ability to think on his feet. He had to make Jaros play his game, not the other way around. Dorian took a deep breath and crouched low, his eyes scanning the ground. The boulders, the sharp outcrops, the open spaces, all of it could work to his advantage if he played it right. He knew the terrain well enough now to use it as a weapon. The key was patience. He couldn't rush this. He had to wait for Jaros to make a mistake. The warlord growled, his voice rising in anger. With a burst of speed, Jaros charged forward, the ground shaking beneath his heavy steps. He moved like a storm, his massive sword swinging in wide arcs, each strike designed to crush anything in its path. Dorian's heart leaped into his throat. Jaros was coming fast, and he wasn't holding back anymore. Dorian darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the first swing of the warlord's sword. The force of the blow sent a shockwave through the air, but Dorian didn't have time to marvel at the power behind it. He had to keep moving. Jaros didn't slow down. The warlord swung again, aiming for Dorian's midsection. Dorian ducked, just in time, and the blade whizzed above his head. His heart pounded in his chest, but his focus was unwavering. He knew what he had to do. With another quick glance around, Dorian saw a narrow gap between two large boulders nearby. He couldn't waste this opportunity. Dorian sprinted toward the gap, moving quickly, his feet light on the uneven ground. Jaros, unable to stop his momentum, followed him into the narrow space. The warlord's large frame barely fit through the gap, and Dorian took advantage of that. As soon as Jaros tried to follow, Dorian pivoted, using his smaller size to his advantage. He grabbed a loose rock from the ground and threw it at the warlord's head. Jaros grunted as the rock hit, momentarily disorienting him. Dorian didn't wait for Jaros to recover. He dashed out from the gap, moving quickly to a higher point on the arena. From his new position, he could see everything. Jaros, the traps, the obstacles. The warlord was still disoriented, but he was starting to regain his composure. Dorian knew he had to act fast before Jaros adapted to the new tactics. He spotted a boulder perched precariously on the edge of a cliff above the arena floor. It wasn't the perfect weapon, but it could give him the opening he needed. If he could dislodge it, it would fall directly onto Jaros. Dorian gritted his teeth and ran toward it, his legs burning with the effort. Jaros, still reeling from the earlier distractions, didn't see Dorian's approach. With one swift motion, Dorian kicked at the base of the boulder. It tumbled, and Dorian quickly backed away. The boulder rolled down the slope, gathering speed as it went, heading straight for Jaros. The warlord looked up just in time to see the massive rock hurtling toward him. He tried to dodge, but the boulder clipped him, sending him stumbling backward. He crashed to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of him. For a moment, there was silence. The crowd held its breath, and Dorian felt a flicker of hope. Jaros was down, but it wasn't over. He needed to finish this now, before the warlord could get up. Dorian moved quickly, his every step filled with urgency. He had already won the first round of this battle, but the final strike would decide everything. Dorian Vex stood a few paces away from the fallen Jaros, his breath heavy, his heart still racing from the intense combat. The warlord was down, but Dorian knew better than to celebrate just yet. He could see Jaros stirring, his massive form beginning to push itself off the ground, his eyes flashing with fury and determination. The warlord had barely been slowed by the boulder, and Dorian felt the cold, harsh truth settle in his chest. The battle wasn't over. Jaros was a force of nature, and if he got back on his feet, the fight would turn deadly once again. The crowd roared, excited by the back-and-forth nature of the battle, but Dorian barely noticed the noise. All that mattered was the present moment. The way the ground felt beneath his boots, the way Jaros slowly rose to his feet, shaking off the rubble that had clung to him. His grip on the sword tightened, his muscles tensing as if every fiber of his being was focused on getting back to his feet and taking vengeance. Dorian didn't have time to hesitate. He had to move, to act now while the warlord was still disoriented. In that split second, Dorian recalled Vylessa's voice in his head. Remember, speed and wits over strength. The faster you think, the better your chances. She had been right. Strength was something Jaros had in abundance, but Dorian had the advantage of being agile, quicker to adapt, and more resourceful. The Nyari warlord's overwhelming physical power wasn't enough to win this fight, not if Dorian could keep his wits sharp. Without waiting for Jaros to fully recover, Dorian launched himself into action. He dashed to his left, moving at full speed, his eyes scanning the arena for the next opportunity. The boulders, the uneven ground, the cliffs, it was all part of his plan now. Jaros, still trying to regain his balance, swung his sword through the air, slashing at the empty space where Dorian had been moments before. But Dorian wasn't there. He had already moved, ducking behind a large rock just in time to avoid another deadly swing. The Nyari's sword cleaved through the air, missing Dorian by mere inches. The sheer force of the attack sent vibrations through the arena, but Dorian wasn't intimidated. He had seen this before. Jaros was relentless, but he was predictable. The warlord's attacks were all about raw power. He relied on overwhelming his opponent with strength, not speed or finesse. Dorian could use that to his advantage. Taking a deep breath, Dorian peered around the boulder to see where Jaros was. The warlord had missed, but he was quickly recovering, his eyes narrowing in on Dorian's hiding spot. With a battle cry, Jaros charged forward again, his sword raised high. The roar of the crowd grew louder as they anticipated the next move, but Dorian had no intention of letting the warlord land a fatal blow. Dorian's mind raced as he calculated his next move. He couldn't stay behind the boulder forever. He needed to make Jaros think he had the upper hand, only to pull the rug out from under him at the last second. The Nyari was too focused on Dorian's location to see the trap that was slowly unfolding. As Jaros neared the boulder, Dorian bolted from his position, sprinting toward the edge of the arena. Jaros followed, his massive form gaining on Dorian with each heavy step. But Dorian was faster, darting between rocks and obstacles, his body moving fluidly, always staying one step ahead. He needed to get the warlord to follow him into the narrow, rocky part of the arena, the place where the terrain was tight, and Jaros' size would be more of a hindrance than an advantage. With a quick glance over his shoulder, Dorian saw Jaros just a few feet behind. He knew this was the moment. As he approached the narrow part of the arena, he turned sharply and dove behind a large boulder, out of sight. Jaros charged forward, his sword swinging in a powerful arc, but he didn't realize he was headed straight for a dead end. The narrow canyon between the rocks was just ahead, and if he went too far, he wouldn't be able to turn around. The boulders on both sides were too close for him to maneuver. Dorian's pulse quickened as he waited, hidden behind his cover. Now it was time to strike. Dorian rushed forward, using the terrain to his advantage, and leaped onto one of the rocks just above Jaros' position. With a single powerful move, he launched a rock down toward the warlord's head. The rock hit with a satisfying thud, and Jaros staggered, losing his balance and crashing to the ground once more. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the warlord had been defeated, but Dorian knew better than to assume victory too soon. Jaros' roar of fury echoed across the arena, and Dorian braced himself. He had to finish this, but before he could make his next move, Jaros pushed himself up, his eyes burning with renewed intensity. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Dorian Vex stood his ground, sweat dripping down his forehead, his body aching from the relentless battle. His breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles screaming for rest. But there was no time to stop. Jaros was back on his feet, more furious than ever, his dark eyes burning with vengeance. The warlord's sword was gripped tightly in his hands, and every movement he made was filled with raw power. Dorian knew that he had to end this now, or else he would be crushed by the sheer force of the Nyari warlord. The crowd roared, their excitement fueling the intensity of the fight. The arena seemed to shrink around Dorian, every sound, every breath magnified. He could hear Jaros' footsteps pounding against the ground, the warlord's heavy stride getting closer with each passing second. There was no more room for hesitation. Dorian's mind raced as he thought about his options, knowing that one wrong move could be his last. Vilesa's voice echoed in his mind, a reminder of everything he had been taught. Use your speed. Outsmart him, and you'll win. This is your chance. It was a simple message, but it held the weight of everything he had fought for. The future of humanity rested on his shoulders. If he failed here, all would be lost. But if he succeeded, he would prove that humanity could stand up against the most powerful warriors in the galaxy. Dorian's gaze shifted to the arena. The boulders, the uneven ground, the cliffs, they were all part of his strategy. The warlord's strength was undeniable, but Dorian had the advantage of agility, and if he could continue to use the terrain to his advantage, he could wear Jaros down. The key was endurance. Dorian had to outlast him. As Jaros charged forward, swinging his sword in wide arcs, Dorian darted to the left, narrowly avoiding a devastating blow. The warlord's sword missed by inches, the force of the strike sending a shockwave through the arena. Dorian's heart pounded in his chest as he kept moving, staying light on his feet. He needed to get Jaros to overextend, to leave an opening for him to exploit. Jaros' growl of frustration echoed across the arena as he repositioned himself, his eyes never leaving Dorian. The warlord had learned to anticipate his movements, and Dorian could see that he was adapting to his tactics. This would be a fight of endurance now. Dorian couldn't afford to make a mistake. The warlord charged again, his massive sword slashing through the air. Dorian dove to the side, rolling to avoid the blow, and then quickly sprang to his feet. He moved toward the edge of the arena, his eyes scanning for the next opportunity. The terrain was rocky, but it offered plenty of places to hide, to confuse Jaros, to make the warlord lose track of him. Dorian's muscles screamed for a break, but there was no time. He needed to keep the pressure on. As Jaros closed in, Dorian reached for a sharp rock from the ground, hurling it at the warlord's head. The rock hit its mark, but Jaros barely flinched. Instead, he swung his sword, sending a powerful shockwave through the arena, causing Dorian to stumble back. The impact was almost enough to knock him off his feet, but Dorian quickly regained his balance, his feet firmly planted on the uneven ground. Jaros was relentless, his fury only growing with each failed strike. The warlord was starting to make mistakes, his movements becoming more erratic, more desperate. Dorian saw it, the brief moments of hesitation, the signs that Jaros was tiring. It was small, but it was enough. Dorian knew that this was his chance. He had to go on the offensive, to take advantage of Jaros's mistakes. With a burst of speed, Dorian dashed toward the warlord, aiming for the space just behind him. As Jaros swung his sword once more, Dorian ducked under the strike, his body low to the ground. With one fluid motion, he jumped onto Jaros's back, using his smaller size and agility to his advantage. Jaros roared in fury, trying to shake Dorian off, but the human held on, using the warlord's own momentum against him. With everything he had left, Dorian plunged his dagger into the warlord's exposed neck. The blow was precise, aimed at the weak spot in Jaros's armor. The warlord's body went rigid, his massive frame trembling as the life drained from him. His sword fell from his hand, clattering against the ground. For a moment, everything was still. The roar of the crowd faded into silence, and Dorian stood, panting, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Jaros's massive body collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud. The warlord was defeated. Dorian had won. The crowd erupted in cheers, their deafening roar filling the arena. Dorian's legs trembled, but he remained standing, his eyes scanning the arena for any sign of another threat. He had proven that humanity could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest warriors of the galaxy. The battle was over, but the war for survival was far from finished. The roar of the crowd echoed through the arena, deafening and overwhelming, as Dorian Vex stood tall over the fallen Jaros. His body was bruised, bloodied, and utterly exhausted, but the overwhelming feeling that swept through him was not pain. It was triumph. He had done it. He had defeated the mighty HFY warlord, the one who had made every other champion tremble in fear. His victory was not just his own, it was humanity's. He had proven that humans, no matter how small or outmatched, had the heart, the courage, and the brilliance to stand toe-to-toe with the most powerful beings in the galaxy. But the victory felt strange. Dorian couldn't celebrate just yet. He looked down at the lifeless form of Jaros, his mind racing. The battle was won, yes, but the war had only just begun. He knew that defeating Jaros in this arena would only stir the HFY's hatred even further. There would be more challenges, more enemies, and humanity's survival was still on the line. The eyes of the galaxy were watching, waiting to see if they would fall or rise. Vylessa's words from earlier echoed in his mind, a soft whisper amidst the chaos of the moment. This victory is just the beginning, Dorian. It's a message, a signal that humanity won't be easily wiped out. He nodded to himself, knowing she was right. This was just the start of something bigger. They had shown the galaxy that they were not weak, not helpless. They had fought, and they had won. But what came next? What would this victory truly mean for the future of humanity? As the crowd continued to cheer, Dorian felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. His energy was spent, his body close to giving out. He staggered slightly, but his resolve remained firm. He couldn't let this moment slip away. He had to stay focused. Behind him, Vylessa stepped onto the arena floor, her figure a comforting presence in the chaos. She made her way to him, Her eyes locked on him with an expression that was equal parts relief and admiration. "You did it," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "You showed them all that we're not to be underestimated." Dorian managed a tired smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It wasn't just me. It's all of us. Humanity doesn't stand alone." Vilesa's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. "You've given humanity something they desperately needed: hope." Dorian's thoughts flickered back to the early days of the war, the helplessness, the fear. He had seen so many lost, so many fall to the Nyari's superior technology and vast armies. But today, in this arena, he had stood as a symbol of defiance, of resistance. He had fought for every human who had lost their life, every soldier who had fallen, every family torn apart by the war. This victory was theirs as much as it was his. As the sounds of the cheering crowd began to fade into the background, Dorian's eyes moved to the horizon. There, in the distance, the great warships of the Nyari still loomed, massive and intimidating. The battle for the galaxy wasn't over, but they had made their mark. Today, humanity had shown its strength, and the universe would take notice. "We've won today," Dorian said quietly, almost to himself. "But the real fight is still ahead of us." Vilesa gave him a determined nod. "We'll face it together. We've already come this far. There's nothing that can stop us now." Dorian looked around the arena, taking in the cheering faces of the spectators, the roar of victory that filled the air. He felt the weight of the moment settle into him, a mixture of pride and exhaustion. He had fought hard for this, and he had earned his place among the greatest warriors the galaxy had ever known. But there was still so much to do. With a final, deep breath, Dorian raised his fist to the sky, a symbol of victory and defiance. Humanity would rise. They had the heart, the spirit, and the will to face any challenge the universe threw their way. And no matter how many battles they fought, they would never back down. The crowd's cheers reached a deafening crescendo, and as Dorian stood there, victorious, he realized that this wasn't just a win for him. It was a win for all of humanity. And no matter what came next, they would face it together, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.